Huddled against the brutal wind, Mary pressed her trembling hands against her swollen belly, whispering desperate prayers to the dark, merciless sky. The snow fell like a shroud, thick and suffocating, burying the small cabin her husband had built before the fever took him. Alone and with labor pains beginning to ripple through her body, Mary fought back tears, determined not to succumb to the cold or despair. She remembered his words, whispered in the firelight, promises of safety and warmth, a future filled with laughter. But now, with the wolves howling in the distance and the fire's last embers fading, hope felt like a cruel illusion. Suddenly, through the haze of snow, a figure materialized, tall, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, moving with purpose. Fear gripped her, and Mary clutched the rusty rifle left behind, unsure whether to call for help or remain silent. The figure paused, his dark eyes finding hers, and in a deep, calm voice, he said, "You are alone and with child. Let me help." Mary hesitated, the chill seeping deeper into her bones, but the man did not advance, respecting her fear. "My name is Kale," he continued, his breath misting in the freezing air. "The storm grows worse. If you stay here, you will not survive." Mary glanced at the dwindling fire, the ice creeping in through the cracks in the walls, and finally lowered the rifle. Kale stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow, and laid down his bow and quiver to show he meant no harm. "My people camp nearby. We have food and shelter," he offered, his gaze gentle but firm. Mary's mind raced, torn between trusting a stranger and facing certain death. A fierce contraction gripped her, forcing a sharp cry from her lips, and Kale knelt beside her, his hands steady and warm on her shoulders. "You must come now," he urged, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Exhausted and frightened, Mary nodded, and with surprising strength, Kale lifted her into his arms, carrying her into the swirling snow as the night closed in around them, his presence a fragile thread of hope against the encroaching dark. Kale trudged through the snow, each step deliberate, his powerful arms cradling Mary as she whimpered against his chest, the pain intensifying with each contraction. The wind howled like a beast, tearing at his cloak, but Kale moved forward with grim determination, his jaw set and eyes narrowed against the blinding flurries. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice a steady drumbeat against the chaos. "We are close." Mary's breath came in ragged gasps, her fingernails digging into his shoulder as another wave of pain crashed over her, stealing what little strength she had left. Kale's village lay nestled within a dense copse of pine trees, the smoke from their fires rising like phantom signals against the night sky. As they approached, the elders emerged, faces shadowed and solemn, their eyes widening at the sight of the unconscious white woman in Kale's arms. "She is with child," Kale said, his breath clouding the air, "and she will not survive the night without help." The women rushed forward, taking Mary from him and carrying her into the largest teepee, its entrance flanked by buffalo hides that billowed in the wind. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming, the air thick with the scent of herbs and burning cedar. Kale knelt beside Mary as the medicine woman pressed a steaming cup to her lips, urging her to drink. "She is burning up," the old woman said, her hands moving swiftly to check Mary's pulse, and the firmness of her belly. "The child comes too soon." Kale swallowed, his jaw clenched as he watched Mary's face contort with another contraction. "She was alone," he said, the words heavy with unspoken grief. "Her husband is dead." The old woman nodded, her dark eyes meeting Kale's. "Then she has no one." Kale's fists tightened at his sides, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. "She has me," he said, the vow hanging heavy in the warm, smoke-filled air. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming like a chorus of lost souls. But inside the teepee, Kale remained at Mary's side, his hand clasping hers as if by sheer will alone he could keep her tethered to the land of the living. Mary screamed as another contraction ripped through her fingers clawing at the buffalo hide beneath her, the pain a relentless wave threatening to drag her under. Kale hovered nearby, his jaw clenched, helpless against the agony racking her body. The medicine woman chanted softly, her hands moving in practiced rhythms over Mary's belly, her voice a steady cadence against the chaos of the storm outside. "Breathe," she commanded, her eyes never leaving Mary's contorted face. "The child is coming fast." Sweat poured down Mary's brow despite the freezing air, her breaths shallow and quick, each one a desperate gasp for life. "I can't," she panted, her eyes rolling back as another contraction struck, fiercer than the last. "You must," the medicine woman said firmly, her hands pressing down in a rhythm meant to guide the child into the world. Kale knelt beside Mary, his large, calloused hand encasing hers, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of pain. "You are strong," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You are stronger than you know." Tears streamed down Mary's face as she gripped his hand, her nails digging into his skin. "My baby," she sobbed, fear slicing through her like a knife. "What if I lose my baby?" Kale leaned closer, his voice a low, calming rumble. "You will not lose your child. Not tonight. Not while I am here." The medicine woman's chants grew louder, more urgent, her fingers tracing sacred symbols over Mary's sweat-soaked forehead. Outside, the wind roared like a beast, slamming against the teepee, as if the storm itself were fighting to break through. Mary's screams echoed through the village, drawing wary eyes from those gathered around the fires. But no one dared speak. Inside, Kale whispered words of strength, his hand never leaving hers, his spirit entwined with hers in that moment of raw, unrelenting struggle. The medicine woman's hand stilled, her eyes widening. "Now," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Push!" Mary bore down, her scream rising to a fever pitch, her entire body straining as if it might tear apart. And then, as the storm reached its peak, a piercing cry cut through the night. A baby's first wail, fragile yet fierce, a tiny sound that held the power to break through the darkness. The baby's cry echoed through the teepee, a fragile, piercing sound that cut through the storm outside like a sliver of light through darkness. Mary's body sagged against the buffalo hide, her eyes fluttering closed, exhaustion crashing over her like a tidal wave. The medicine woman swiftly wrapped the newborn in a thick, woven blanket, her practiced hands moving with gentle precision. "A strong boy," she said, her gaze shifting to Kale, who knelt beside Mary, his hand still clasping hers. "The child lives." Relief coursed through Kale, and he released a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. "Mary," he whispered, leaning closer, his dark eyes searching her pale, sweat-soaked face. "You did it. Your son is here." Mary's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, confusion clouded her gaze. Then the medicine woman placed the tiny bundle against her chest, and the confusion melted away, replaced by a raw, overwhelming love. "My baby," Mary breathed, her voice cracked and weak as she pressed a trembling kiss to the newborn's brow. "You're safe now." The child whimpered, his tiny fists flailing as he nestled closer to his mother's warmth. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. But inside the teepee, a different kind of storm raged, one of emotions too fierce to contain. Kele watched mother and child, a lump forming in his throat as he rose to his feet, his presence suddenly feeling intrusive, unnecessary. "I will go," he said quietly, stepping back toward the entrance, the wind biting through the opening like 1,000 icy knives. "Wait!" Mary called, her voice stronger than before, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Kale." He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs as he met her gaze. "You saved us," she said, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket as if it were a lifeline. "Stay." The word hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning, a single syllable that could alter the course of 2 lives. Kale's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "I will not leave you," he said, his voice firm, but laced with a tenderness that surprised even him. "Not until you are strong again." Outside, the storm began to subside, the howling wind giving way to a softer, almost mournful silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Days passed in a haze of pain and recovery, the storm outside finally relenting to reveal a world blanketed in ice and snow, the land a desolate expanse of white beneath a leaden sky. Inside the teepee, Mary cradled her newborn son, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of his cheek as he slept, his tiny breaths a steady, soothing rhythm against her chest. Kele sat by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes, his gaze fixed on the blade, though his mind was elsewhere. "You don't speak much," Mary said, her voice soft, a tentative attempt to bridge the silence between them. Kale did not look up, his jaw tight. "Words are not always needed." Mary swallowed, her eyes drifting to the fire where shadows danced against the walls like restless spirits. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "For saving us." Kale's jaw worked, his hands pausing mid-motion, the knife glinting in the firelight. "You were not meant to die in that cabin," he said, his tone flat but his eyes dark and haunted. "Not like your husband." Mary flinched, her heart lurching painfully. "How did you know about him?" Kale set the knife down, his shoulders tense. "I found him," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "In the woods. The fever had already taken him." Mary's breath caught, and she clutched her son tighter, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You buried him?" Kale nodded, his gaze dropping to the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in his eyes like trapped ghosts. "I prayed for his spirit to find peace," he said. "But his last words were of you." Mary's throat closed, and for a moment the teepee felt too small, the air too thick. "What did he say?" Kale hesitated, his fists clenching against his knees. "He begged me to find you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To keep you safe." Mary's tears spilled over, hot and unchecked, her body racked with silent sobs. Kale rose, moving to the entrance, his jaw set, his back rigid. "You are safe now," he said, his voice distant, hollow. "But safety comes at a price." And with that, he stepped outside into the biting cold, the wind slashing against his skin as he closed his eyes against the memories he could not forget. Memories that whispered of a promise he had yet to keep. Kele trudged through the snow, his breath misting in the frigid air, each step a deliberate attempt to bury the memories clawing at the edges of his mind. The woods stretched around him, vast and silent, the trees weighed down by thick blankets of snow that creaked and groaned beneath the icy wind. He had gone out to hunt, to clear his head, to escape the sight of Mary's tear-filled eyes and the child's soft, helpless cries. But as he crouched by a frozen stream, his senses pricked, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Someone was watching. Kele's hand moved to his knife, his dark eyes scanning the forest, muscles coiled and ready to strike. "You hide well," a voice said, smooth and familiar, the words dripping with contempt. Kele stiffened, his jaw clenching as a man stepped forward from behind a cluster of pines. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face marked by the distinctive scars of a warrior, his eyes cold as the winter sky. "Dakota," Kele said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Dakota's lips curled into a sneer as he folded his arms, his gaze sweeping over Kele with open disdain. "I heard you brought a white woman into the village," he said, the accusation heavy in his tone. "A widow," Kele corrected, his shoulders squaring. "And her child." Dakota's eyes narrowed, his jaw ticking. "Your father would not have allowed this," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous pitch. "The council is already talking. They say you have brought a curse upon us." Kele's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. "I will not let her die," he said, his voice fierce and unyielding. "Not when her husband's dying wish was for me to protect her." Dakota stepped closer, his breath hot against Kele's face. "You owe that white man nothing," he spat. "But your loyalty to our people, where is it?" Kele's heart pounded, each beat a thunderous drum in his ears. "I made a promise," he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "And I will keep it." Dakota's eyes gleamed, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "A promise to a dead man," he said, stepping back. "But what of the living? Will you betray them too?" Without another word, Dakota melted back into the trees, his shadow swallowed by the endless white, leaving Kale standing alone, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his fists trembling with the weight of a choice that threatened to shatter everything he had ever known. Kale returned to the village with a heavy heart, the echoes of Dakota's words haunting him like a restless spirit. Inside the tipi, Mary lay wrapped in thick blankets, her baby nestled against her chest, both of them asleep, their breaths rising and falling in unison. The sight of them stirred something deep within Kele, a fierce, protective urge that both frightened and anchored him. But as he stepped inside, the medicine woman appeared, her dark eyes sharp, her expression grim. "The council has called for you," she said, her voice low, urgent. "They say the white woman brings a curse." Kale's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to Mary and the baby. "She is no curse," he said, his tone flat. "She is a mother with a child, nothing more." The old woman shook her head, her fingers twisting a bundle of dried sage. "Dakota has spread fear like wildfire. He tells them you have forgotten who you are, that you have chosen the white woman over your own blood." Kale's fists tightened, anger coiling like a snake in his gut. "Dakota seeks power," he said, "not truth." The medicine woman stepped closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Be careful, Kele. Dakota has the chief's ear. If he convinces the council that the woman and her child are a threat, they will demand you send them away. Or worse." Kale's breath caught, his chest tightening as he glanced again at Mary, her face pale and gaunt, her baby's tiny fist curled against her collarbone. "They will not harm her," he said, his voice a steely promise. "I will not allow it." The medicine woman nodded, her wrinkled hand reaching out to clasp his. "Your heart is good, Kele. But a good heart can lead to ruin if it blinds you to danger." Kele swallowed, his throat dry, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a boulder. "Then I will see the council," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "And I will make them understand." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a mournful, chilling wail that carried the scent of blood and betrayal. Kele wrapped his cloak tighter around his shoulders, his heart pounding like a war drum as he strode toward the council fire, where shadows loomed and accusations waited to be cast like stones. Kele stepped into the council circle, the air thick with the scent of burning sage and simmering tension. The elders sat in a half-moon formation around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, eyes cold and hard as river stones. Dakota stood to the right of the chief, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "You come late?" the chief said, his deep, gravelly voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "And with much to answer for." Kele straightened, his jaw set, his eyes meeting the chief's without wavering. "I have saved a woman and her child from death," he said, his voice firm, steady. "That is all." Dakota stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed malice. "You have brought a white woman into our camp," he said, his voice loud, echoing through the circle. "A woman who carries the blood of those who have taken our land, who have broken our treaties, who have killed our people." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, eyes narrowing. Kale swallowed, his fists clenching beneath his cloak. "She is alone," he said, his voice rising above the noise. "Her husband is dead. She has no one but a newborn to protect. Is that the enemy you fear?" Dakota's lip curled. "You speak of pity," he said. "But what if she is a spy? What if she brings more of her kind to our doorstep, claiming to be weak and helpless, only to strike when our guard is down?" The chief leaned forward, his dark eyes piercing. "Dakota raises a fair question," he said. "How do we know she is not a danger to us all?" Kale's heart hammered against his ribs, his mind racing, words sticking like stones in his throat. "I know because her husband's dying wish was that I protect her," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a vow. "I will stake my life on it." Silence fell over the circle, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Dakota's smirk widened, his eyes narrowing to slits. "And if you are wrong," he said, his voice a cold, dark whisper, "then it will be your life and hers." The chief's gaze bore into Kale's, and in that moment Kale felt the full weight of his choice, the heavy, crushing burden of a promise that might very well cost him everything. Mary awoke to the sound of raised voices outside the teepee, the angry, fevered murmur of men in council. Her heart pounded as she clutched her baby closer, the child's warmth the only comfort against the cold dread gnawing at her insides. The medicine woman knelt beside the fire, grinding herbs in a stone bowl, her face set and grim. "What is happening?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. The old woman's hands paused, her dark eyes lifting to meet Mary's. "They speak of you," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow, "of the danger you bring." Mary's breath caught, her arms tightening around her son. "I am no danger," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "I only want to protect my child." The medicine woman nodded, her expression softening. "But they do not see a mother. They see an enemy." Outside, the voices grew louder, Dakota's voice rising above the others like a war drum, his words sharp and accusing. "She will bring more of them," he shouted. "More white men to take our land, to slaughter our people." Mary's blood ran cold, and her gaze darted to the entrance, fear twisting in her gut. "Where is Kele?" she asked, her voice cracking. The medicine woman's jaw clenched, her eyes dropping to the fire. "Fighting for you," she said, her tone laced with pain. "But his strength may not be enough." Mary swallowed, the taste of bile sharp on her tongue. The child whimpered, his tiny fists flailing, and Mary rocked him, her tears falling onto his soft, dark hair. "I must go to them," she said, her voice shaking. The old woman's eyes widened, her hand shooting out to grasp Mary's arm. "No," she said firmly. "You are weak, and they are angry." But Mary shook her head, her eyes blazing with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I will not let him fight alone," she said, her voice hardening. Not for me. With trembling legs, she rose, clutching the baby close to her chest, her heart pounding as she stepped outside into the bitter wind. The men stood in a circle around Kele, Takota's voice a venomous hiss in the air, the others nodding as he spoke. But when they saw her, their words fell away, their eyes narrowing as she stepped forward, her child pressed tight against her chest, her gaze fixed on Kale's. I am no enemy, she said, her voice ringing out over the wind, stronger than she thought possible. I am only a mother, and I beg you, do not take from me the only protector my son has left. The wind howled through the village, swirling snow around them like a veil as Mary stood in the center of the council circle, her baby clutched tight against her chest, her eyes fierce and unblinking. Takota sneered, stepping forward, his dark eyes fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. A mother? He said, his voice dripping with disdain. Or a spy sent to weaken us from within? The men murmured, their faces hard and expressionless, their eyes darting between Takota and Kele, who stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. She is no spy, Kele said, his voice ringing with defiance. Her husband was a good man. He died asking me to protect her and her child. That is the promise I made, and I will not break it. Takota scoffed, his lip curling. You would betray your own people for the sake of a white woman and her wailing brat? Kale's jaw tightened, his muscles straining as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I betray no one, he said, his eyes blazing. But you seek to spread fear and hatred where there is none. You seek to take a life that has done you no harm. Takota's fists clenched, his chest heaving as he glared at Kele. You dare speak to me of harm? My brother was killed by her kind, my father's land stolen by her kind. Kele's heart pounded, but he held Takota's gaze, refusing to back down. And would you spill innocent blood to avenge it? He asked, his voice lowering to a growl. Would you take the life of a mother and child as they took from you? The air crackled with tension, the men around them shifting uncomfortably, their expressions conflicted. Mary's knees trembled, but she stood firm, her baby whimpering softly against her chest, her eyes never leaving Keel's. Takota's face twisted with rage, his hand darting to his knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. But before he could strike, the chief raised his hand, his voice booming through the night. Enough! Silence fell over the circle, the only sound the wind wailing through the trees. The chief's dark eyes swept over them all, his expression stern. We are not savages, he said. We do not harm women and children. Kele will keep his promise. The woman and her child will stay. Takota's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with fury, but he said nothing. Kale stepped back, his shoulders sagging with relief as he met Mary's gaze. In that moment, as the wind howled and the snow fell, a fragile peace settled over them, a single thread of hope woven against the dark. The village lay silent beneath a blanket of snow, the teepee fires burning low, their embers casting faint, wavering shadows against the night. Inside the teepee, Mary cradled her son, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. Across the fire, Kale sat cross-legged, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames, his jaw tight, fists clenched. The chief's ruling had granted them a fragile reprieve, but Takota's fury still lingered like a storm on the horizon. Outside, the wind howled, carrying whispers of discontent. Men murmured in low voices, their eyes darting toward Kale's teepee, suspicion gleaming like daggers in the dark. Takota's words had sown seeds of doubt, and those seeds were now taking root, spreading through the camp like wildfire. Mary watched Kale, her heart heavy. You are not safe, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not while Dakota breathes. Kayla's eyes met hers, dark and determined. I will not abandon you. Before she could respond, a shout echoed through the night, a cry of alarm, sharp and urgent. Kale shot to his feet, his knife flashing as he moved to the entrance. Outside, a group of men stood gathered in a tight circle, their faces hard, eyes glittering with anger. Dakota stood at their center, his chest heaving, his face twisted in a snarl. You think you can protect them? Dakota sneered, his voice booming through the camp. This woman is a curse. Her kind will bring ruin to us all. Kale stepped forward, his stance firm, unyielding. She is a mother, he said, his voice calm but powerful. A woman who has lost everything, and I will not let you harm her. Dakota's lips curled into a feral grin. Then you will die with her, he spat, drawing his knife, its blade gleaming wickedly in the moonlight. Before Kale could respond, a small, trembling voice cut through the air. Stop! The crowd parted, and Mary emerged, her baby clutched to her chest, her eyes fierce despite the fear that trembled in her bones. Dakota, she said, her voice strong and clear, you hate me because I am white, because my people took from yours. But I did not take your brother. I did not steal your land. And my son... Her voice broke, and she swallowed, holding the baby closer. He is innocent. Dakota's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing to slits. Your kind will always be the enemy. Kale stepped between them, his back to Mary, his body a living shield. If you want her, he said, his voice a low, deadly growl, you will have to go through me. Dakota's eyes blazed with fury, and he lunged forward, his knife aimed at Kale's heart. But Kale was ready. In a flash, he sidestepped, grabbing Dakota's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife fell, clattering to the ground, and Kale swept Dakota's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling into the snow. Dakota snarled, rolling to his feet, but Kale was on him in an instant, his knee pressing down on Dakota's chest, his fist poised to strike. This ends now, Kale said, his voice a low, lethal hiss. You will not touch her. Dakota's eyes flashed with defiance, but beneath the rage there was fear. You would kill me for her? He spat. Kale's jaw clenched, his breath ragged. I will kill you to protect what is good, to protect what is right. The chief stepped forward, his face grim. Enough, he said, his voice booming. Dakota, you have brought dishonor to our people. You have attacked one of your own without cause. Leave, and do not return. Dakota's eyes widened, his jaw working, but he said nothing. The men stepped back, their faces averted, their silence a clear verdict. Dakota rose to his feet, his gaze locking onto Kale's, a promise of vengeance burning in his eyes. Then he turned and stalked into the darkness, his shadow swallowed by the night. Kale exhaled, his shoulders sagging as the tension ebbed. He turned to Mary, his chest heaving, his eyes soft. You are safe now, he said, his voice rough. Mary stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. You risked everything for us. Kale shook his head, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. I made a promise. Mary swallowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. And what of the promise you made to yourself? The one that keeps you alone? Kale's jaw worked, his eyes searching hers, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I cannot forget the past, he said, his voice thick with emotion, but I can choose to protect the future. Mary stepped closer, her baby nestled between them, her gaze unwavering. Then stay, she whispered, her hand finding his. Stay with us. Kale's heart thundered in his chest, his fingers tightening around hers, and in that moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The snow fell softly, like a blessing, the wind a gentle caress against their faces. The village watched in silence as Kale drew Mary closer, his arms wrapping around her and the child, a new family forged in fire and pain, bound by promises and love. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon,